Live from the heart of the Blue Ridge, Roanoke, Virginia. It's the Just Bernard Show with host Bernard Alvarez. Join Bernard as he shares topics that reveal the real matrix and empower your human experience, including world liberty, the esoteric, suppressed technologies, spiritual ascension, and human consciousness. Humanity has awakened, and our time has come to realize our full potential. And now, live from the Star City, your host, Bernard Alvarez.
Bernard, I'm delighted to be speaking to you, and my message is to talk about a wonderful man called Christian O'Brien, who left the oil industry in 1971 to the CBE. He headed up the oil companies in Iran, and he decided that he was going to learn to translate the early languages, particularly archaic Hebrew, and in particular the Sumerian cuneiform, which are related to the oldest document and record we had, which had been translation had been attempted by Professor George Barton, the Reverend Professor, and they were called the Karsag Epics. And Barton thought they were simply incantations and hymns, but O'Brien, once he translated all of those documents, realized that what they were the story of our ancestors who restarted civilization after the Younger Dryas Ice Age at a place called Karsag, which is below Mount Hermon. And what this gives us is a reality of the fact that we, our most ancient ancestors, had to start again after this dreadful catastrophe in 10,850 in the stories of the flood, etc. Mm-hmm. So we've now got for everybody to see the story about the gods and who they were. And they were real live people, and they were very advanced, and so advanced, in fact, which you find a lot of references in the Hebrew Bible about things we're only just learning about today. They could heat gold to 6,000 degrees to produce pure gold, which we've only just been able to do in the last 100 years, and a whole range of very important advanced features. So we now have an accurate record to look at, to learn where we are in the terms of our civilization and the civilization that came before, which was even more advanced than we are now.
That's very fascinating. And first of all, let me at least welcome you to the show, Edmund. I want to thank you so much for being a part of this and sharing this information with us. I think that it's an alternative, I don't want to say an alternative timeline or alternative history, but it seems that so many researchers are finally digging into beyond what we're being told is, you know, the so-called history of humanity, and so much more is coming to light, especially with the research of Christian O'Brien, as you were just explaining a little bit about. Now, were they able to, or did you actually get to go to the location to survey the area that you're making reference to? What they call the Garden of Eden, for lack of a better term.
That's right. O'Brien had to work it out from the Ordnance Survey maps, and he was a surveyor, very skilled surveyor. He was in the army as a surveyor, apart from being an exploration geologist, which required lots of surveying. And he identified the various sites by looking at the French Ordnance Survey maps of the area which was to the west of Mount Hermon. I sent two guys with a camera to look at the whole site, and we've got lots of photographs, and they came back and confirmed every little detail that O'Brien had talked about in the book and produced on his maps, which are in the book, which is called The Genius of the Few. And the most interesting feature was, it was at the time where we began to have the first Google images. And I looked at the first Google image of the area, and I could see this great watercourse still there, the remains of it on the edge of this wide plain, which is about 1,500 acres, which was a lake bed. And this is a story, of course, of not the river that went out of Eden, but the watercourse that went out of Eden and was parted by sluices and put into irrigation channels. So we got that particular story nailed there. And all the links and references to Mount Hermon and Enoch's visit to visit the great Lord. There is a reservoir, there are orchards, there are all sorts of features. There are a lot of water features that are still working on site. And we've managed to get all the interest from the key people in the Lebanon, and they're featuring the Garden of Eden site as an important site on their website. But it's very difficult, of course, to get the establishment to accept the fact that everybody else has been wrong in terms of looking for the Garden of Eden in many other places, particularly in the area of the Tigris and Euphrates and the Gulf, simply because the sea levels have risen so much. That valley has would have had ice chunks flowing down it at the time the earth warmed up, and so this was a self-facing slope, had all the meltwater from the snow from the mountains of the anti-Lebanon mountains on which Mount Hermon is on. So they had all the conditions there to restart agriculture in particular. And an early site which they went to was Jericho, which was an even warmer site because it was about 1,300 feet below sea level. And then we have the story of Jericho, which is recorded as the oldest town. And lots of features there, like finding round houses changing to square houses, lime plaster, the domesticated fig, one of the earliest features in 9,500 BC, and all the important seed grains and plants and domesticated plants all arriving at that area in the same time, which we call the Levantine corridor. That's from Jericho up to Damascus.
So is it fair to say in these findings and whatnot, is the story of Eden, I'm sure my viewers and listeners are interested in this, is the story of Eden a modern translation of perhaps an archaeological, or I'm sorry, an ancient civilization that perhaps was one of the first agricultural communities, and I guess because they were the first, it was translated into this mythological bigger than life area and story. Is the Garden of Eden just a historical place with magical underlines, and we can get into that in a moment?
Well, the Genesis record is interesting because we're told that God was called Elohim. Well, Elohim is a plural word. Yeah. El is a singular God. And so the Elohim translates very simply as the shining ones. And in the Hashemin has got Shem in the middle of that word. And that translates properly as the planted highlands. So we have the plural Elohim in the planted highlands, and they were led by a man called An, and the correct name for them is the Annunaki, the people of the god An, and not Annunaki, which is a later interpretation by Zechariah Sitchin. But Sitchin got a lot of the points right, he got a lot of them wrong, but the point is that we've been able to dig out the truth of the story, which is incredibly important for mankind to understand where we've come from, and I hope it will help us to know where we should be going.
Yes, absolutely. I feel the more we again, the more we understand where we come from, hopefully it will empower us to move forward in a more enlightened way. Speaking of the shining ones, with that being said, how much of you mentioned Zachariah Sitchin? I always found his work to be fascinating, and yes, I did know that he got some of it mixed up or translated incorrectly or got some of it plainly wrong. But how much of the concept of Anunnaki that we have mythologized in the alternative history realm or paranormal realm is correct, and how much of it is how much of it is true, how much of it is mythology?
Well, unfortunately, there's a lot is mythology, and as you know from all the Bible texts, all the different records, they're very good in some respects because the genealogy has been particularly good. But so many of the names have been changed over time, and we so many different names for the gods, for example. But we go back to that same group. But what is interesting is that the Sumerians, 3,000 or 4,000 years later, thought so much of the gods who delivered everything that they dedicated their towns in the Tigris and Euphrates area to the families, the original families. And of course, the original families had all died by that time, but it was a dedication of those gods and what they did for us, which led the Sumerians to naming the various cities. So Mari, for example, Mari was a name for the lady who was called Ninhursag, and she was the lady who was effectively the governor of the Garden of Eden. And of course, in those days, women had total equality of men, which is a very important point. And you've got a wonderful situation where that obviously learned from their ancestors that civilization can work very effectively and efficiently. But they were faced with an almost total wipeout with the cometary debris that came in over the northern areas of the North Pole of America, in the Hudson Bay area, and also in Scandinavia, of large object impacting. And then, of course, the Earth being moved on its axis by about 15 degrees. And one of the things we find that's so interesting from the surveying point of view and the astronomy point of view is that the angels and the watchers, who were the part of the team with the Annunaki or the Archangels, they had to resurvey the whole of the planet. And of course, Professor Hapgood produced those wonderful maps and that marvelous work to show that the Earth had been mapped very accurately by air 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, which is an important point. And that's been confirmed by 2 or 3 other people, and Livio Sticchini, O'Brien, Tom Brooks, and others. And we find, in fact, that our Druid ancestors were able to build on Bodmin Moor in England an incredibly sophisticated observational astronomy observatory, Druid, for all young Druids to learn about astronomy. And that's dated at 2,500 BC. So there are wonderful links and wonderful clues which open up a really sensible, factual story about our civilization and our ancestors, and so much that we can learn from this once we bury all the prejudices which have been heaped upon us by our universities, which have tended to be tied to the Catholic Church or other religions, and have not wanted to break ranks because it would have upset the priests, for example. So these are the kind of issues which come out in the wash on this particular subject. And we all have to keep an open mind and actually discover this incredibly exciting information. And I believe very useful information from the point of view of understanding how we can connect with what I call plugging into an intelligent and responsive universe. O'Brien called it Surat Shabad Yoga, and that will fit in with so many people who believe that we do have the mental ability to plug in to an intelligent and responsive universe. And that is a principle, I suppose, of spirituality, and what Jesus was actually teaching to his advanced group of disciples after the crucifixion. It was a Hebrew document witnessed by Matthew, Philip, and Thomas as a legal document. It was only discovered in about 1750, the Askew Codex and the Brute Codex. And those documents put a totally different picture on our understanding of both Christianity and the concept of anything to do with a spiritual word, about our ability to think beyond our own normal brain operations.
Yes, here, here. And I couldn't agree more, as someone who has been lucky enough to experience that plugging in sensation, even if it was for brief periods of time. It's amazing how the universal knowledge is available to all of us, should we practice the methods and techniques to be able to plug into that. And with that being said, I can't help but notice throughout my years of study, and I'm sure with your years of study, and for most of our listeners, what they've read up on and have listened to on these types of programs, how there seemed to be this, an era of time on the planet where everything was connected, in the sense of, for example, pyramids on different continents. And I don't know if we want to call it mystery schools. I don't even know if it was considered a mystery back then. It was just a part of the educational system, as you were pointing out, as the Druids did, and how that seemed to be the norm prior to what I call the patriarchal oppression, starting with ancient Egypt, but or should I say the later dynasties of Egypt. But with that said, now I find it very interesting that in let's see, I believe it's in the information you sent me about the book. Is it the Shining Ones, I want to say?
Yeah, I can't put them up, but it's the Shining Ones is the masterwork, which will soon be available as an ebook.
Oh, good.
And then there's the Genius of the Few, which was the first book that was published by O'Brien. And then the one that really interests, I think, you is called The Path of Light, which is translation and rearrangement of the Askew and Bruce Codices, which are these documents which were recorded and witnessed by the disciple scribes Matthew, Philip, and Thomas. Thomas being particularly important because in all my recent work, it's clear that Thomas was the twin brother of Jesus. And we also have this very clear evidence now that there was a very close link with the Romans and Jesus being educated at the court of Augustus with Thomas as well. And Jesus later being called Bran, which is in fact an archdruid, or the title of the archdruid, and being credited with delivering Christianity to Britain. And that's the latest work that I've been involved in. And I'm producing a YouTube video on that subject, but I've had to do a hell of a lot of work. I've got a fantastic amount of information. It's been very exciting. And everywhere I look, I can find clues to support the whole concept that Jesus was part of Augustus's court. He was educated from the age of 12 with Thomas, best possible education you can imagine. He actually was the man they called Cuno Bellinius. The title of the Druids gave him, Hound of Bel, and he was Britain's most successful king. He had a large family, one of whom was Caractacus, and we have a very solid foundation for the founding of Christianity being based with the Druids, with Jesus being an archdruid. And the proof is produced by the Reverend R.W. Morgan in St. Paul in Britain, where Reverend R.W. Morgan makes the point that the Sermon on the Mount is pure Druid. And there are other key people, William Blake and many others, who see that link between what Jesus is actually saying and what the Druids were actually teaching. And all young men, well-connected young men in Jesus' time, had to complete their education in Britain. There may have been 60,000 young people being educated in Britain at the peak. And of course, the Druids were so much more sophisticated and so much more advanced, because unfortunately our Catholic Church and our universities in Britain seems to have done everything they can to diminish the importance of the Welsh records and also the role of the Druids and the incredible degree of sophistication in Britain over that 3,000 or 4,000 year period. And of course, the Druids covered the whole of Europe. They were linked to the Brahmins and to the Vedas and the Hindus, and it was one quite big, happy family. And so Jesus, when he eventually traveled across and founded, or with Thomas, the Syriac church, Jesus had no difficulty in going to places like Taxila, which was the center of Buddhism, and making friends with everybody and having a tremendous influence. He and Thomas had a tremendous influence over 1,000 years, until about the time that Islam and Catholicism began to erode that original belief system, which is quite simple, really. It was just, as Jesus said, it's doing unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, Edmund, I'm very curious because in some of the information that you sent, you mentioned how the restart of civilization after the global cataclysm was helped along by the Watchers, the Tuatha Danaan, and the Druids. And that's very interesting to me because I quite don't have a grasp on the Tuatha Danaan. I get different interpretations from different researchers and different books, but can you share with us what you found out about Tuatha Danaan and how the Watchers, Tuatha Danaan, and Druids kind of did help us to restart civilization after the cataclysm?
Well, one of the things that was very important and lasted right the way through into the Sumerian times was that they had very much a role society. You actually had people who were master craftsmen in their trades or professions, and that worked right the way through from the senior group of 7 who were the Archangels, and one dealt with law. Sharmesh dealt with law. Damascus used to be called Shams after Sharmesh, which isn't far away from the Karsag or Garden of Eden site. And you then have the angels, and the word angel, in fact, should be translated and understood as En-gel-li, which mean lords of the cultivation, because the whole revolution in understanding all the domestic crops and the domesticated animals and what that involved, that was the key issue of actually not having to be a hunter-gatherer, but to getting civilization up and running with lime to correct the acidity of the soil, and about 15 really important things that made agriculture work, but all arrived at the same time, same place. Otherwise, it would never have worked. I've dealt with that in detail in Learning from History, Part 14. The role society concept is important because we're facing today a situation where, if we just example take Mari, the city on the Euphrates, fantastic city on the Euphrates, and there's a wonderful image of it on my website, which is www.goldenageproject.org.uk. There were over 200 craft, trades and skills. And the king was appointed to, with a partner who was a woman, to run the country. There was always a king of kings, very important, who was called a Shishak in Sumeria, and they'd all get together, and if the one king wasn't doing his job properly, they'd all be sorted out, and we get the same story with Jesus in Camelot at the Round Table at Colchester much later on. But the point is that the craft, trades and skills were absolutely vital, because there were even laws stopping a stonemason from telling a carpenter what to do, and a carpenter couldn't tell a stonemason what to do. And that went through everything. Nowadays, you've got a situation where people get a degree at university and they put in a job by a politician to tell people who were been doing the work for years and passing it from father to son, and then you've got one hell of a muddle. And so there's a tremendous amount to be learnt there, and that goes right back to your question about the archangels, the angels, and the watchers, the Nephilim, who were large and strong and can do the difficult jobs which needed heavy work. And then you had the Iggy, who were very small and short, were the ideal miners and wore leather hats, and you see images of them, stone carvings in the Americas. And you also have so much evidence too that the Phoenicians, who inherited the Annunaki and were part of the Tuatha Danaan, the people of the god An, that's what Tuatha Danaan means. And you find that these peoples spread around the planet very quickly. And it's very important to realize that at places like Tiwanaku, you find the gateway to the sun as a symbol on top of the gateway to the sun, and that's Marduk holding the two pillars which were famous on Solomon's temple, very important features, bright lamps actually, but they were features. But I don't want to go on any longer, but other to say that everything evolved and spread out from that particular site right around the planet. We can trace it with all the languages and the words used right the way through. So everybody on the planet can go back to that starting point, because there were very few people left after the Great Catastrophe.
Absolutely amazing. And thank you so much for sharing all of this information with us. We need to start wrapping up, but I want to make sure that we touch on the Golden Age project that was set up by the Patrick Foundation. And this is the reason for this project is to be able to share this type of information. Am I correct in that?
Yes, I started this by knowing my uncle, not very well, but I knew he was a brilliant man. And I was at a point where I wanted to find out about agricultural history. And so I picked up the phone and said, where did the first farming start? What do you know about that? And he said, well, I've just finished my book, which is The Shining Ones, and I'll send you the proof. I've only got 3 copies. And I got the proof and saw this book, and I just couldn't believe it. And then I went to see him, and he agreed with me. He said, look, nobody's going to listen to me, but what I'll do is I'll pay for printing 100 books, and you can distribute 50 of them, and I'll distribute 50 of them, and we see where they go. And that's after he had a very unfortunate publishing experience on My Genius of the Few, which did make a lot of friends, but the publishers, like so many publishers, went broke and didn't make any effort to market the book at all.
Oh, yeah.
And so I felt that this work was so important that I literally went to live in a library with 20,000 books with a lovely man called Nigel Blair. And in 1999, I thought, well, I'm going to really dig into this myself. I've got a tremendous push and help from my uncle and my aunt, who was involved in this, particularly on the religion side. And I thought, well, I'll continue their work. And my uncle actually died age 86 in 2001, and my aunt died last year. And I'm continuing their work and trying to get this message across to the world that we've got a fantastic story to tell, which has been covered up, hidden, and confused in the same way that every single religion has got a basic fundamental story, but they've all got to come back together and do what Jesus basically explained that they should do, and build on this constructively, because we've reached a point where civilization is destroying itself.
Yeah.
we're not able to cope with coronavirus. We may not be able to. And we've got many other things we're not coping with, in that we are now talking about UN Agenda 21, which is to wild everything and bring farmers and people off the land back into high-rise cities, you know, totalitarianism all over again. Complete and utter madness. Yeah. And it's a majority view, unfortunately, to the unwashed, the uninformed. The people need guidance and help to save the planet literally now. Whatever happens with this dreadful virus, we've got to realize that we have got to a point where if we don't learn from history, then our civilization, or any chance of a really successful civilization, will be lost.
Beautiful. And I couldn't agree with you more. And I thank you for sharing that thought in such an eloquent way that I wouldn't have been able to. So let me let everybody know again and remind everyone of the goldenageproject.org.uk to get more information. My guest today is Edmund Marriage, and he will, hopefully I'd like to have you come back when we have a little more time, and you seem to have so much information that I would love to pick your brain some more in the future.
Well, thank you so much. I'd love to come back, and this is a subject where we can both enjoy talking about it.
Oh, certainly, certainly. All right, well, we're going to wrap things up, everyone. I want to thank you all for watching and joining us today. You are watching the Just Bernard Show, and we will be back next Tuesday at our regular time. Have a wonderful week. Stay home, be safe, and I love you all very, very much. Bye-bye now.